everything from all threats. So developing awareness helps your security teams to focus on the most important parts of the business. To become a resilient security organization, you really need to become aware of the core purpose and goals of the business. You need to define those critical services, processes, and assets and formalize them. You need to become aware of the key threats that the business may face, including high-impact, low-frequency threats. You need to align those resilience objectives to the business mission and define that strong defensive baseline aligned to those resilience objectives. And you need to be intelligence-led with an active defense capability that adapts to the evolving threats and vulnerabilities. Now, scenarios are a brilliant tool for planning and testing your defenses. A good scenario is framed in business language and backed up as much as possible by evidence, in other words, intelligence. Now, I recently did some work for one of the UK's largest banks, developing intelligence-based cyber threat scenarios that we used to develop and to test the effectiveness of a £100 million investment plan. But you actually don't need to be a huge corporate to reap the benefits of scenario-based planning. A threat scenario that all businesses must prepare for is ransomware. In other words, the scenario that your customers become infected, your systems become infected, and taken out of action by criminals to extort money. Becoming operationally resilient to ransomware is extremely hard, but it starts to become more manageable if you break your business down into its critical services and supporting processes and assets. Then you can start to ask and answer some important questions like, would it matter if your orders book gets lost? Would it matter if your fabrication machinery loses its instruction set? Would it matter if your order terminal stopped working? How long could you continue business without these things? What do you need to do to prevent that scenario from happening? What do you need to do to detect it before it wipes your business out? And what do you need to do to respond and recover your critical services within acceptable times? Now, you must accept that you will never identify all the critical assets first time round. And that's really the purpose of scenario-based planning, to challenge your assumptions, to generate feedback that helps you to align your defensive posture. Now, intelligent vulnerability management is an essential part of an adaptive security organization. As we've discovered, the threat and vulnerability landscapes are constantly evolving. Now, to protect your business mission, you need to take a risk-based approach to managing your vulnerabilities, protecting your critical assets and processes and services. Tenable is a dominant partner in vulnerability management because they understand this, and their products take the heavy lifting out of risk-based vulnerability management. I'm going to hand over to Dan now, and Dan's going to talk about the critical function that risk-based vulnerability management plays in a resilient organization. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Alistair. Hi everyone, thanks Alistair. I'm going to talk about operational resilience and how vulnerability management fits within that framework. So the three key topics I'm going to cover are why traditional vulnerability management no longer works, real versus hypothetical threats, and risk-based vulnerability management with Tenable looming. So first we're going to look at why traditional vulnerability management no longer works. So actually the 4 Adarma A's fit in very well with this. In traditional vulnerability management, there's generally a lack of awareness. People don't cover their assets fully, they don't understand what those assets do. They don't align their vulnerability management program to their business either. It's not adaptive. Things like CVSS are very static scoring systems, and people don't evolve with the threat that's occurring. And there's also a lack of assurance. When people in traditional vulnerability management worlds report to the board, they're very unpopular people because they generally turn up with a 300-page Excel spreadsheet full of vulnerabilities and say, this is where we're at. Now, these approaches no longer work. So we moved towards risk-based vulnerability management a while ago now, and people like Gartner are starting to pick up on this approach as well. You can see from Gartner, they also agree with us as the way forward. They think people taking this approach will suffer 80% fewer breaches compared to a traditional vulnerability management approach. So why is that? Well, in 2018 alone, there were over 16,500 new vulnerabilities announced, of which nearly 60% were critical and high. So if you're trying to fix 60% of vulnerabilities, you're spending all your time targeting the wrong things and too much of them. Because actually only 7% of the vulnerabilities ever had a publicly available exploit kit written for them. And only 5% ever there's any evidence got exploited in the wild. So you're spending your time and your resources fixing these 59% of vulnerabilities that actually don't pose a threat to you. There's no intelligence suggesting that they pose a threat. But what's even worse than that is not all of the 7% exist within that 59%. So even if you closed all those 59% of critical and high vulnerabilities, you wouldn't actually close all the vulnerabilities that have live threat attacks associated with them. And so even if you try narrowing it down and decide you would go for just the critical, that would still be 15% of those vulnerabilities that you would be trying to address. And so this statistic, I think, to me, shows why this isn't working better than pretty much any statistic I've seen on the subject. What you can see on the right-hand side is 34% of exploits. The organization were aware of the vulnerability existing before the exploit occurred, which says one of a few things. It could be that they didn't prioritize that vulnerability properly. They didn't understand the importance of the asset or the exposure of the asset that vulnerability resided on, or they were remediating their vulnerabilities far too slow. So I thought that was a really telling statistic, but a couple of nights after I read this report, I actually woke up in the middle of the night and thought, oh, that's not the real problem. What about the 66%? 66% of organizations have vulnerabilities on their network that get breached and they're not aware of it. So they're not understanding the threat to their organization properly. And they're not adapting to the changing world as well in the modern attack surface. Which leads on to real versus hypothetical threats. So it's important to understand what actually poses a threat to you as opposed to a hypothetical threat. There are many, many CVSS 10 out of 10s that have never been exploited in the wild that don't pose a real threat to you as an organization. So to assist with this, we at Tenable added a component to our core vulnerability management solutions called predictive prioritization. And what this does is this looks at over 160 data attributes for every single vulnerability that we're aware of. And it compares them to things like past breaches, past attacks, looks at research data, threat intelligence. It produces a vulnerability rating for each of these vulnerabilities to say how likely that vulnerability is to be exploited in the next 28 days. And this could be a vulnerability that's never been exploited yet. With some organizations, this led to a 97% reduction in the number of vulnerabilities they need to remediate, whilst reducing the same level of threat to the organization. So there's some pretty big numbers on this. So how do we do this? So we track over 55,000 vulnerabilities, and we take threat feeds from over 10 threat providers. So this data is very adaptive. with over 9,000 distinct threat sources. So as you can imagine, we're helping you out here. We're helping you be aware of the threat to your organization posed by these vulnerabilities. And so if you combine all of those together, it's over 20 million aspects that we analyze every day. It's also adaptive because we actually reassess these every single night. So every 24 hours, we give every vulnerability a new score based on the current threat data and also based on the attributes of that vulnerability. So why does the CVSS approach no longer work? This is a real world example of an actual vulnerability. So there's quite a few things. So as I said, the CVSS score is a static score. It doesn't change. It doesn't evolve based on what's actually really happening to a vulnerability in the wild. So it's not adaptive at all. As the VPR score is an adaptive score. You can see here we understand the vulnerability and the threat it poses. So the vulnerability here on day one, we provided a score. It didn't seem like it was going to be a very important vulnerability. The attributes of the vulnerability itself suggested that it was highly unlikely to be exploited. However, then there started to be exploit code written and publicly available POC code. And then there was discussions on the dark web, so the score jumped again. But over time, as the threat declined to this vulnerability and it wasn't being exploited, the score then leveled off. And 60 days in, there was then dark web activity again. But as you can see, it took over 60 days just for the CVSS score to be assigned to this vulnerability. And in 2018, on average, it took 19 days for a CVSS score to be assigned to a vulnerability. So it's static, it's slow, and there was a whole bunch of them that never even got a score due to the backlog. So the VPR helps you adapt to what's really happening in the wild and understand the current threat and the future threat that vulnerability will pose. But that's only half the story. So understanding what threat a vulnerability poses doesn't necessarily answer the question of what threat does this vulnerability pose to me. So we built on this with a product called Lumin, which its core is risk-based vulnerability management, but with extra on top of that. So we built on this approach to help you understand what threat does this vulnerability pose to my organization. So as you can see here, we consider these the three stages of vulnerability management. You have vulnerability management at the start. People use things like CVSS. We've talked about the problems with that. They do some scanning of the attack surface and a bit of understanding. The risk-based vulnerability management builds on that, and it helps you understand the threat the vulnerability creates for you by helping you understand the business impact of that vulnerability. It does this by combining how important the assets are to you as an organization, how exposed they are, and how important the vulnerability on those assets are. It then helps you to look forward and start fixing vulnerabilities that will probably cause a threat to you as a business. We build on that further, and we created a discipline we call cyber exposure management, which actually takes it to the next level. So it's all well and good understanding what's important to you as a business, but you also need to be able to understand whether what you're doing in the first place is valid. Are your assessments good? Are you scanning all of the assets in your organization? Are you getting credentialed scans on all of them and understanding all the vulnerabilities that exist on those assets? Are you scanning frequently enough? Because if you're not doing the basics right to start with, the prioritization is a waste of time. So that's really where with Lumin we help you build on that, and then that helps you align your vulnerability management program to your business, and also be adaptive to as the nature of vulnerabilities and the threats towards those vulnerabilities change. So how do we help you focus on what to fix first? So the vulnerability priority rating is the score that comes out the predictive prioritization module I mentioned earlier. This is in our vulnerability management platforms. This helps you understand how bad a vulnerability is, what is the real threat associated with it. Then we combine that with asset criticality rating, and this is where we assess the attributes of the assets in your organization and we assign a criticality rating to them. Now, this rating can be overwritten by you if you feel you have this data and you understand it better. But we work to what we call a 90-10 rule. So the attributes we assess on assets are things like device type, internet exposure, software that's running on it, personal identifier information, various operating systems, various things like that that help us determine fairly accurately about 90% of the time how critical an asset is or isn't to you. The other 10% may be, so for instance, we might find an asset as critical because it's a SQL server, it's in your DMZ, or it's a web server or something like that. But we can't tell if it's just a test server and actually has no real value to you. So what we do is we combine these two scores. So we say, what are the critical vulnerabilities on critical assets? And we give you a prioritization of what you should fix based on what matters to you most. And it may also be that we consider a medium vulnerability on a critical asset more important than a critical vulnerability on just an end user device or a desktop, etc. So on top of that, we provide you with benchmarking as well. So when we've combined all of this together, we give you what we call a cyber exposure score, which is the risk posed to your business by the vulnerabilities and the assets they reside on across your whole estate. Now, we also give you the ability to compare this to your peers, the wider organization. You can compare business unit to business unit as well. And we provide you with maturity metrics. So we also help you understand whether your program is working. We help you with provide assurance to your board that what you're doing is correct by how do you do compared to your industry peers? Are you scanning correctly? Are you assessing your devices properly? Are you remediating quickly enough? How are you improving over time? And we really help you have business conversations with board level people around vulnerability management so that you can help them understand how well are you actually doing, as opposed to just dumping a big document of vulnerabilities on their desk. So this is a screenshot of the Lumen homepage, and as you can see here, we give you actionable intelligence and aligned to you as a business, so you can see how well your assessment maturity is doing. As I said, what grade are you? What actions do you need to take to improve your program? Are you scanning frequently enough? Are you scanning well enough? Are you covering your whole estate? How do you compare to industry standards? How are you trending over time? Are you reducing the risk to your organization? And this doesn't just look at things like the number of vulnerabilities on your network. It also looks at how long they existed. So the real threat that vulnerability poses and the asset it resides on. So the real threat poses to you as a business. So you can compare to your peers. What's our score? How well have we done recently? How well do we compare to our industry and the wider Tenable population? And also, as I said, actionable intelligence. So what actions can you take? What top 10 actions could you take today that will reduce the risk to your business the greatest? So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Alistair. Thanks, Alistair.
You're on mute, Alistair.
Hi there. Apologies for that. I was just trying to find the button. Thanks, Dan. That really brought to life the importance of risk-based vulnerability management. So if you take away anything from today on the wider topic of operational resilience, I would like it to be these questions. Are you aware of the core purpose? And this really doesn't matter what your role is in your security organization, whether you're an exec or a technical SME, these really should apply to everyone. Are you aware of the core purpose and goals of the business? Have you defined the critical services, processes, and assets? Are you aware of the key threats that your business may face? Have you aligned your resilience objectives to the business mission? Have you defined a strong defensive baseline aligned to your resilience objectives? Are you intelligence-led with an active defensive capability that adapts to the evolving threats and vulnerabilities? And finally, is your defensive capability monitored and assured? If you have any questions or concerns about your overall defensive maturity, or if you need expertise to help specific defensive objectives, please do get in touch with us after this. We would be delighted to help. So I'm going to open up to the Q&A now. So I'm just going to have a look and see what questions have come in on the Q&A. Okay, and if you do have a question, if you just enter it into the chat window.
Hi, Alistair. I think there's one in there already. It says, how does predictive prioritization work for new threats that haven't been exploited yet? I think that's one for you, Dan.
Okay, let's pass that one to Dan. Are you okay to take that one, Dan?
Yeah, sure. So part of the reason we call it obviously predictive prioritization is it looks forward and not just what's happening. So those 160 attributes that we assess for every vulnerability, the weighting of them changes over time. So on day one, the fact that there's been no threat against that vulnerability carries very little weight, but the attributes of it do. So for instance, at the extreme end, if there was a new vulnerability announced tomorrow and it was for SMB, it required no credentials, it was easily exploitable, we would start flagging that up to you on day one before there'd been any actual live threat. So this is where it's very different to just using threat intelligence, is we can help you look forward as well as just taking a view. Because the only downside with threat intelligence is for you to prioritize something because it's being exploited in the wild. That means someone has to have been exploited first. Whereas obviously with the predictive prioritization, looking at these attributes, looking at vulnerabilities of the same type or for the same software, how common is that software? What were there exploits for it before? All of these sort of things all feed in to help us determine how likely it is to be exploited even on day one.
Thanks, Dan. Does that answer the question? I think that was from Constantine.
Yep, okay. Yes, it does. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much, Dan.
Super.
Thank you.
I couldn't find the chat window, so can I just ask a question verbally?
Go ahead.
Thanks. How do you actually go about doing this assessment? Is it a case of putting monitors on systems? Is it a qualitative assessment mixed with some quantitative data you gather from your clients? What's the actual kind of process for doing the assessment?
Can you just clarify which assessment?
Well, the threat assessment. So I was just of the talk, but I was just interested. What's the actual kind of process for engaging with the client, and then kind of what happens? Are you putting monitors on their equipment to say, right, we can see that you've got these potential threats, or is it a a questionnaire, or how are you kind of deriving the statistics for a particular client that said, come to us and do a security assessment?
I see. Yeah. Okay. We have a number of different approaches to doing professional services assessments for our customers, and really depending on what the goal of that the customer's goal is, we do have a security maturity assessment, which just looks at your overall security capabilities and their maturity, and helps you to define a target state. We also do have the capability to go in and really do a threat assessment against your business, looking at what sector you're in, looking at the services you provide and the customers that you work with, and looking at the available threat intelligence to build up a picture at quite a strategic level of the threats to that business. And so, really, hopefully what's been coming through the strand of this presentation is having that high-level awareness of the business and the threat landscape. So understanding your business is one side, and you probably don't need our help to understand that at high level, although we find that customers do often need help in really articulating the critical services and processes and assets and formalizing those. When it comes to the threat landscape, that overall high-level view does help you to really align your resilience objectives. Now, at a lower level, we have services which, for example, will take your, if you have a detective function, for example, you have Splunk monitoring in your organization, we have services that will look at the technical threats that are out there and evaluate your controls against those threats at quite a technical level. Does that answer your question? You might be on mute.
Ali, do you mind if I just butt in for a second? I'm just going to say very quickly, there's quite a few of the Adarma team on here. We've also got customers on here, so we'll do a bit of an internal session separately. But obviously the floor is open to questions for anything that's relevant to customers and end users.
Yes, it did answer my question. My computer froze. Apologies.
Okay, no worries. Thank you.
Thanks.
And if you do have any questions, you want to go through any of that in more detail with us, just get in touch afterwards.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. I'll leave it open for a couple more minutes. And then if there's no more questions, we'll close it off.
Ali, will you be sharing the content once we're done?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, I've recorded the session, so anyone that wants it, yeah.
Lovely, thanks.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to take that as no more questions. So just to finalize, thank you so much for taking your time this afternoon to explore the topic of operational resilience with us. I hope you found it informative. And if you do have any questions following the presentation, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.